In the experimental study, the main independent variable again was violent video game play. What we did was we had two separate video games. One was very violent in nature and graphic, and the other was non-violent in nature. So those were the two levels of the independent variable. The dependent variables were aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, and aggressive emotions.
The independent variable in the experimental study was expected to be related to the dependent variable in the following way. We expected those who had been randomly assigned to play the violent game would later on behave more aggressively than those who had been assigned to play the nonviolent game.
In order to find out if the independent variable causes a change in a dependent variable, scientists established two different groups of subjects. In the first, the experimental group, they manipulate the independent variable to see what effect it has on the dependent variable. In the second group, the control group, there is no such manipulation.
The reason we use a control group is because always when you have an independent variable, you have to have at least two groups within that independent variable. For example, the experimental group and the control group. Let's say, for example, I was studying violent video game effects, and all I did was take some students, have them play a violent video game, and then measure their aggression. Well, then I would say, hey, these students had a certain level of aggression, but the question would be, are they aggressive or not? Compared to what? And so I have to have something to compare them to. And the role of the control group is to act like a baseline.
And for that reason, we want the control group to be essentially the same as the experimental group in all features, as many as possible, with the exception of the independent variable. As we want them to be the same kind of people, we want them to be treated the same way by the experimenters. We want them to play a game that is as equally enjoyable or frustrating. We simply want the groups to differ on one thing, and that one thing in this case is, does the game contain violent content or not?
One way the researchers achieve this sameness between groups is through random assignment of the subjects.
In order to show cause and effect relationships, one needs to assume that the groups in a study, the participants in a study, initially began as equal or nearly equivalent. The best way to ensure that is to use some kind of a scheme where individuals who have agreed to participate in a study are assigned to an experimental or control group based on chance. In this way, the characteristics of individuals that differ naturally in the world, that these characteristics could somehow be evened out across experimental and control groups initially.
What we do is randomly assign participants to either the control group or the experimental group, and random assignment means that each student had an equal chance of being in one of those two groups.
Random assignment is essential to valid results. For instance, if Anderson and Dill had allowed the players to pick which game to play instead of assigning them to games, the more aggressive players might have chosen the more aggressive game. It would have been impossible to determine if any later aggressive behavior was due to the game or to just their personality. Likewise, it's important to ensure that other variables cannot have caused the results.
The control group differed from the experimental group only in the content of the game that they played. In all other respects, they were treated the same. They were the same kinds of people. We had males and females in both groups. We had high and low trait aggressive people in both groups. The way that the experimenter treated them in terms of instructions, how long they played the game, all those sorts of things were essentially identical.
We try to make the environment for those participants as similar as possible, except for the independent variable of video game violence. So the students came into the same laboratory. It was the same room, same temperature, same surroundings. They sat in the same sized cubicle. They had the same experimenter. And time of day was a random factor such that students came all during the day at different times, and that was not tied to whether they were in the experimental or the control group.
Furthermore, the two games themselves were selected to be similar in a lot of ways. Both are called first-person games. They were equated in terms of how much our participant population enjoyed playing them on average. They were equated in terms of how much physiological arousal they induce in people when they play them. So that the two conditions really differed primarily in terms of that violent content, that is, the independent variable itself.
Once the subjects had played the game, the researchers next measured their aggressiveness.
We used a standard laboratory measure of aggressive behavior. It's called the competitive reaction time task. It's been used, or various versions of it, have been used for well over 35 years now. In this task, the participant believes that they're competing against another person who's in another room, sitting at another computer, on a series of reaction time trials. They put headphones on, they hear a tone, they click a mouse button. Whoever responds slowest is punished by a blast of noise, we call it white noise, static essentially, over the headphones. Now in reality, there is no other person. It's all computer controlled.
We analyzed the data using a statistical technique called analysis of variance, and what that looks at is it tries to find group differences. So in our case, was there a difference in the amount of aggressive behavior between those who had played the violent video game and those who played the non-violent video game? And our analysis of variance confirmed that this was the case. The results of the study indicated confirmation of our first two hypotheses, but not the last one. In other words, we found that playing violent video games in the laboratory caused increases in aggressive behavior and aggressive thoughts, but not for our third hypothesis, which was increases in aggressive emotions.
This study also showed that this short-term exposure to a violent video game increases aggressive thoughts, one of our other dependent variables. And that was pretty much as expected by the theory. We also found that people who score high on measures of trait aggression do, in fact, behave more aggressively than those who score low.